Welcome in or welcome back to the Veiled Archive. We don't often audit anthologies in the Veiled Archive. The structural integrity of a short story collection is inherently volatile. Usually, when an architect attempts to string together a dozen separate nightmare engines, the result is tonal whiplash. Maintaining a high fidelity dread across multiple disconnected narratives is a mathematical improbability because the observer's psychological immune system adapts too quickly to the start and stop rhythm. But Tucker Jonason's Blood in the Dark forces a radical reevaluation of that mechanic. He hasn't built 13 separate rides. He has built a single massive transit system through the American dark. This isn't a mere collection of spooky stories or recycled campfire tales. It is a forensic, state by state mapping of the American landscape, a clinical trial that weaponizes the folklore of our own geography against us. Joneson deploys what the ledger categorizes as visceral survivalism. He understands that we feel safe because we mistakenly believe monsters have fixed addresses and outdated hunting methods. To correct this, he aggressively drags the observer from the suffocating, claustrophobic urban vampire nests of that house on that street straight into the sprawling, cursed rural claims of a Nebraska cornfield guarded by an organic butchering sentinel. The primary hook of this architecture is its relentless displacement. You are never allowed to acclimate to the threat parameter. One moment you are stranded on the rails of 1936, relying on the predatory, calculated hospitality of the widow, where bodies not in the periphery. The next, you are trapped in the high-stakes, predatory folklore of a deep forest Wendigo and monster. He even fractures the timeline itself in Daddy's Home, where a child's premonitions of her father's injuries prove that you don't even need to leave your living room for the environment to become lethal. Across these shifting environments, the lesson remains brutally consistent. The threat is always native, and the human is always the invasive species. But while the kinetic survivalism keeps the blood pumping, the true anchor of this volume, the reason it has been pinned to the walls of the archive for this deep dive, is the profound psychological siege found in the Crimson Canvas. Here, Jonason strips away the physical geographical threat and forces the observer to confront the invasive breach through a possessed painting crafted by an ancient serial killer. The medium is entirely organic. The threat is strictly visual. It is a literal carnival of carnage that infects the viewer, clinically rewriting the subject's biological purpose from terror to an absolute, unblinking need to bleed. It proves that Jonason doesn't just know how to hunt the body, he knows exactly how to dismantle the mind. Blood in the Dark doesn't just recite old myths, it updates their operating systems. It diagnoses the exact modernized coordinates where those myths wake up, clock in, and start feeding. In the foundational blueprints of the horror hegemony, the architect typically relies on a very specific containment protocol. They trap the subject in a singular, inescapable location, a crumbling Gothic estate, a locked psychiatric ward, a cursed ship drifting in the ice. The dread in these traditional narratives is derived almost entirely from the claustrophobia of a static perimeter. The rules of survival are established early, and the tension comes from watching the protagonist slowly run out of rooms to hide in. We as the observers feel safe because the threat is quarantined. Jonason's primary clinical deviation is his absolute, violent refusal of that static perimeter. Blood in the Dark abandons the haunted house model in favor of a pan-geographic threat matrix. He doesn't isolate a building. He isolates the distinct folkloric frequencies of the entire American landscape and weaponizes them individually. This requires a massive amount of structural confidence because he forces the reader to constantly relearn the rules of survival. The urban legend of a vampire nesting den on that specific city street operates on a fundamentally different dread metric than the rural organic mechanics of a cursed Nebraska cornfield. In the urban setting, the threat relies on the anonymity of the city, the terror of walking into the wrong living room and realizing the neighborhood has been actively ignoring the slaughter next door. But the moment you map that out, Joneson violently shifts the theater. Suddenly, you are in the deep woods of Wyoming, facing the isolated, high stakes slaughter of a Wendigo and monster. Here, the anonymity of the city is replaced by absolute, crushing isolation. There are no neighbors to ignore you. There is only the apex predator in the freezing dark. This isn't just a change of scenery to keep the reader entertained, it is a calculated structural recalibration of the symmetrical debt. By violently shifting the theater of fear from state to state and even across timelines, thrusting us back into the desperate rail riding poverty of 1936 in The Widow, Joneson ensures the observer's defensive perimeter is in a constant state of collapse. Just as your mind adapts to the modern urban threat, the architecture resets to historical predation, demanding a completely different set of survival mechanics. Most anthologies fail right here. They suffer from a terminal case of tonal whiplash that destroys their structural integrity, placing a slow burn ghost story right next to a chaotic alien abduction. Joneson bypasses this systemic failure by anchoring the geographic chaos in what we classify as visceral survivalism. No matter where the story takes place, the core frequency never changes. The pacing remains frantic because the environments demand it. The threat in a Tucker Joneson story is rarely a slow, creeping haunt that gives you time to investigate its tragic backstory. It is the immediate, brutal realization that you have stepped onto a localized, sovereign predatory claim. The characters do not have time to be terrified, they only have time to run. In traditional horror, if you manage to escape the haunted house, you survive. The terrifying realization of Blood in the Dark is that there is no outside. The map itself is hostile. The monster isn't following you from town to town. Wherever you go, you are simply trespassing in a new stomach. To understand the architecture of Blood in the Dark, you have to understand that Tucker Joneson does not exclusively build with words. The origins of this specific audit actually lie outside the digital walls of the Veiled Archive. During our physical fieldwork at a recent convention, we crossed paths with Joshua Bish, a heavily codified returning architect within our ledger. However, it was our initial meeting with Tucker Joneson at that exact same event that served as the primary catalyst for today's analysis. Meeting the architect behind the work often provides the archive with the crucial lens, and in Joneson's case, it revealed a multidisciplinary engine. Joneson is not just an author. He is a filmmaker, a visual artist, and an animator. His background includes studying animation at Woodbury University, and his professional coordinates track him as an animator for Svengoolie on MeTV and an artist for Morgan Comics. He operates his own imprint, Silver Bullet Books, through which he released Blood in the Dark, its follow-up Popcorn and Guts, and even a children's book titled The Soldier Bear. When you look at his Film Freeway portfolio, you see a history of directing, storyboarding, and editing animated horror shorts like Hide and Shriek and Pinhead. This visual pedigree is the Rosetta Stone for his prose. It completely explains why we noted earlier in his frantic pacing, he doesn't write like a traditional novelist. He writes like a storyboard artist. He understands the visual economy of his scene. He doesn't waste time on bloated exposition because, in animation and film, you have to establish the threat, frame the shot, and execute the scare before the audience looks away. This multimedia fluency extends to his social footprint. If you audit his YouTube channel, you won't just find standard book trailers. You'll find walkthroughs of Halloween Horror Nights and theme park construction updates. He understands the literal mechanics of a dark ride, how to physically move an observer through a curated environment of fear. It is no coincidence that a story like Crimson Canvas feels like a high-speed descent into that carnival of carnage. The architect knows exactly how to build a roller coaster. Furthermore, his narrative mechanics are actively being field tested and validated by other curators. This is most evident in the selection of his titular story for inclusion in The Doors of Darkness 2, Trick or Treat, multi author anthology. When an author's standalone coordinate is excised from their own collection and successfully grafted into an ecosystem built by a score of different architects, it proves that his visceral survivalism is structurally sound. Joneson represents a highly specific frequency of independent horror, a creator who leverages a cinematic eye to build localized, highly lethal traps. He builds a threshold, pushes the protagonist across it, and locks the door. By no means exhaustive, the comparisons we formulate have to reach far and wide to accurately cover the breadth of Jonason's work. So, to accurately map the structural integrity of Blood in the Dark, we must pull coordinates from multiple distinct ecosystems. Jonason operates on two separate but overlapping frequencies: the pan-geographic survival thriller and the internalized psychological siege. To evaluate this architecture, we will cross reference his work against two visual mediums and two literary cornerstones to see exactly where his engine aligns with the established ledger. For our visual and lore comparisons, we must look directly at the mechanics of Crimson Canvas. During our fieldwork, we noted an immediate, high fidelity parallel to the expanded comic lore of Star Wars' Darth Momin. For the uninitiated, Momin was an ancient Sith Lord who viewed the dark side not merely as a weapon for conquest, but as a literal, artistic medium. He weaponized physical architecture and sculpture to channel the void, creating monuments that actively inflicted suffering and madness on the observer. Jonason's ancient serial killer operates on this exact same structural blueprint. The artist in the story uses organic matter, blood, viscera, and human residue to craft an infectious visual trap. The resulting painting is not a passive object to be viewed. It is a predatory engine that systematically bypasses the interface as skin to rewrite the subject's biological purpose from the inside out. Furthermore, the descent into madness within that specific story perfectly mirrors the Rakdos cult from Magic the Gathering. The Rakdos Guild operates a literal carnival of carnage, a celebration of the macabre where horror isn't something to be survived, but an infectious frenzy to be joined. In Crimson Canvas, we see this exact psychological reformatting. The victim's initial terror is clinically overwritten by the artifact. The fear fades into a hypnotic admiration of the faces and the blood, replacing the survival instinct with an intoxicating, unblinking urge to participate in the slaughter. It is the ultimate failure of Pillar C, the psyche voluntarily surrendering to the nightmare and calling it an awakening. To map the broader anthology, stories like the urban vampire nesting den in the titular Blood in the Dark, or the high-stakes rural slaughter of Scarecrow, we must look at Michael Dougherty's cinematic anthology Trick or Treat. Like Dougherty, Jonason understands that American folklore is entirely rule-based and heavily location-specific. Dougherty's film aggressively punishes those who violate the sacred, unspoken laws of Halloween within a specific town. Similarly, if you step onto that street in Jonason's urban landscape, or if a group of teenagers dare themselves into the center of a Nebraska cornfield, they have crossed the threshold into a sovereign predatory claim. The environment itself is the enforcer, and the punishment for trespass is swift, kinetic, and absolute. There are no happy endings because the myth of the environment requires a caloric settlement. On the literary side, the collection's unapologetic brutality shares a direct structural link with Clive Barker's seminal Books of Blood. Barker taught the archive that the human body is a fragile, highly permeable interface, often literally a canvas for the horrors of the world to write upon. Jonason applies this same rigorous biological nihilism, whether it's the rail worker being systematically cataloged by the ageless predator in The Widow back in 1936, the desperate grandfather facing the Wendigo folklore and monster, or the inescapable premonitions of gore in Daddy's Home, the self is never secure. The flesh is merely a temporary vessel waiting to be violently breached by the local fauna. Finally, Jonason's modernization of rural and urban myths operates on the same frequency as an adult, heavily weaponized evolution of Alvin Schwartz's scary stories to tell in the dark. He takes the oral campfire warnings we were taught as children and injects them with a clinical, visceral survivalism. He proves that the monsters didn't go away as we grew older and more rational. We simply forgot where their nesting dens were located. In Blood in the Dark, Jonason serves as the cartographer for those forgotten, lethal coordinates. The geographic breadth and the visual pedigree of Tucker Jonason's engine. Now we must take this scalpel to the framework. Welcome to the deep dive. In standard indie horror, you can usually point to a single load-bearing column. A book might rely heavily on Pillar A, the invasive breach, or it might lean entirely on Pillar C, the experimental psyche. But Jonason doesn't build single-pillar traps. His true architectural mastery lies in the structural overlap, the exact moments where multiple pillars bridge together to ensure a total, systemic collapse of the protagonist's reality. Let's look at how he engineers these bridges. The A-B synthesis, geography as the debt collector. The first major overlap occurs when Jonason fuses Pillar A, the invasive breach, directly into Pillar B, the symmetrical debt. In the traditional blueprint, a monster breaks into your house, and then you have to deal with the consequences. Jonason flips this through the threshold inversion. Take the story The Widow. The sanctuary violation isn't the monster breaking in. It's a desperate man in 1936 actively seeking shelter and crossing the widow's threshold. The breach is his own entry into her domain. The moment he steps inside, the symmetrical debt is triggered. The debt is the cost of relying on the other for survival in the wild. The widow prevails because she is the environment's designated debt collector. The same synthesis occurs in Scarecrow. The teenager's physical trespass into the rural cornfield immediately incurs the folkloric debt of the cursed claim. They aren't just killed, they are butchered precisely as they were meant to be. Balancing a localized ledger that was written long before they arrived. The AC temporal bridge, the mind as the breach. Jonason also knows how to bridge Pillar A and Pillar C to devastating effect, entirely bypassing physical geography. Look at Daddy's home. Where's the breach here? It's not a wolfman at the door. The invasive breach is a temporal violation, a premonition of gore. But the delivery mechanism for that breach is the child's own mind, which firmly anchors the story in Pillar C, the experimental psyche. The mother and daughter are existentially entrapped by the prophecy. They spend the day frantically trying to outrun a future that has already leaked into their present. Safety fails because the mind itself is the compromised perimeter. You cannot outrun the monster when the monster is a vision broadcasting from inside your own family's synapses. The BC connect cognitive settlement, paying the debt with sanity. This bridges us to the masterpiece of the collection, Crimson Canvas, which performs a flawless high-fidelity bridge between Pillar B and Pillar C. The narrative is in an art heist. The sin or the debt is the act of greed, the attempt to extract a prize from the dark. But the painting, crafted by an ancient serial killer using human organic material, is not just a cursed object. It is an algorithmic illusion. The debt cannot be paid with money or blood. It must be paid with the observer's sanity. Listen to the specific telemetry of the prose. It was yet nothing, yet something, and then everything all at once. The longer you looked at it, the more you could see within it. The artwork bypasses the rational immune system. The symmetrical debt is collected by systemically reformatting the subject's experimental psyche. The victim's initial terror is clinically overwritten. Fear and confusion fade into a hypnotic admiration, replacing the survival instinct with an intoxicated, unblinking urge to participate in the slaughter. A new life, a new purpose. Now I felt rage, the need to bleed. The mind isn't broken. It is repurposed. The debt is settled when the observer fully merges with the art. the Lovecraft metric, and absolute biological nihilism. When we pull back and look at these bridged pillars through the Lovecraft metric, Jonason's work registers a massive, sustained spike in biological nihilism. Whether it is the urban vampire dens in Blood in the Dark, the high stakes Wendigo run in Monster, or the literal, organic medium of the Crimson Canvas, the human form is never sacred. The interface as skin is merely a temporary, highly permeable vessel. In the Tucker Joneson architecture, human beings are not protagonists. We are currency, a canvas, or a calorie. Individual autonomy is an illusion maintained only until you step onto the wrong street, into the wrong cornfield, or look at the wrong painting. When auditing the fan's perspective for an architect like Tucker Joneson, relying solely on standard retail algorithms like Amazon reviews or Goodreads star ratings provides a corrupted, highly incomplete data set. Because Joneson operates across multiple mediums, his community does not interact with his work like a traditional book club. To measure the true reader response, we have to audit his entire digital footprint, and what we find is not just an author, but a one-man multimedia studio. If you trace the telemetry across his Instagram, his film freeway portfolio, and his professional network on LinkedIn, you see the grind of a creator actively building a brand. His advocates are not just readers, they are consumers of cinematic horror, animation, and practical scares. They are the audience watching his YouTube walkthroughs of Halloween Horror Nights and engaging with his animation work. When they read Blood in the Dark, they aren't looking for a slow, meandering Victorian romance. They are looking for a dark ride. And the consensus within this community is that Jonason delivers an absolute thrill ride. His fans champion the relentless pacing, the localized urban legends, and the sheer kinetic energy of the survival mechanics. They appreciate that the stories read less like standard prose and more like highly polished, high-tension movie storyboards. For this demographic, the structural integrity is flawless because the scares are perfectly timed and visually explosive. But perhaps the most crucial metric of his reader response isn't digital at all, it's physical. As we noted earlier, the Veiled Archive initially met Jonason at a convention. He is an architect actively working the floor, putting Blood in the Dark directly into the hands of the community. He isn't waiting for the algorithm to favor him. He is manually bypassing the digital gatekeepers. This ground level engagement creates a highly loyal, highly vocal readership that champions his work precisely because they have met the architect behind the nightmare. However, this specific architecture does create a distinct polarization. The friction here comes almost entirely from the traditional literary purist. Observers who prefer a slow burn, highly atmospheric character study will find themselves violently ejected from Jonason's passenger seat. The primary critique levied against his frequency of visceral survivalism is that the prose itself can feel utilitarian, hyper-focused on the action, bypassing deep internal emotional monologues in favor of frantic pacing and environmental threat. But the Veiled Archive views this polarization not as a failure, but as a deliberate sorting mechanism. What the detractors call lackluster prose, the archive diagnoses as kinetic efficiency. Jonason knows that if you are sprinting through a cursed cornfield, you do not have the luxury of pausing to admire the metaphorical beauty of the sunset. The polarization proves that the engine works. It successfully filters out the passive observer and rewards the reader who is willing to strap in, hold their breath, and survive the ride. While I find myself trying to be less verbose with the reviews themselves as posted on the retailer's outlets, they don't quite encompass everything I want to say. Thus, the reviews I post aren't always the full reviews I want to post. So there's the review. Then there's the TLDR review people checking out your reviews might actually read. With that said, let's dive in and let's be real for a second. When I sit down to finalize an entry for the ledger, I have to look at what the author was actually trying to build. Blood in the Dark isn't trying to be a slow burn, atmospheric Victorian ghost story. It's a high-speed, cross-country dark ride, and on that front, Tucker Joneson absolutely nails the execution. What really hooked me is the environmental whiplash. One minute you're dodging vampires on a claustrophobic city street, and the next you're freezing in the Wyoming woods or running for your life in a cursed Nebraska cornfield. He keeps you entirely off balance. You can't predict the mechanics of the threat because you're constantly trying to figure out the rules of the new geography. Now, I know some literary traditionalists might argue that the prose leans a bit utilitarian, that it sacrifices lyrical depth for frantic pacing, but honestly, in the context of this visceral survivalism, it works. You don't have time for poetic internal monologues when a Wendigo is breathing down your neck. The stripped down style is a feature, not a bug. It keeps the ride moving at a breakneck speed. But any critique of the prose gets completely thrown out the window when we reach Crimson Canvas. This is the absolute anchor of the book. Just when you think you have Joneson figured out as an action horror guy, he drops this incredibly insidious psychological art heist on you. The way he describes the observer literally losing their mind to the possessed painting, faces in the blood staring back, rewriting the victim's purpose until all they feel is the need to bleed. It is just masterful. That story alone is worth the price of admission and permanently cements this volume's place in the archive. Ultimately, Blood in the Dark is a relentless, unapologetic thrill ride. It takes the campfire myths we grew up with and gives them a vicious, modern bite. And I do have the TLDR version, because as mentioned, there are a lot of people that won't dive into those full reviews when you've got like a page or two up there, when you're trying to support other authors. So, like I said, I try to, when possible, condense the actual review that I'll put on Amazon or Goodreads or any other site that the authors prefer. It's usually those two, though, because that's where you're going to get a majority of your reviews anyway. But without further ado, this is the TLDR version. So, Tucker Joneson's Blood in the Dark is a relentless, high velocity, dark ride through the most vicious corners of American folklore. Instead of trapping the reader in a single haunted location, Joneson violently shifts the geography, dragging you from claustrophobic urban vampire nests to cursed rural cornfields and isolated freeding cabins. It's a masterclass in pacing and environmental dread. The prose is stripped down and kinetic, prioritizing pure visceral survival over slow burn atmosphere, which means the tension never drops. You aren't just reading these stories, you are actively trying to survive them alongside the characters. The absolute crown jewel of this collection, in my opinion, is Crimson Canvas. Just when you think you have the book's action heavy rhythm figured out, Joneson shifts gears into a deeply unsettling psychological nightmare revolving around a possessed painting and a horrific art heist. His background as a visual storyteller truly shines here, creating an infectious descent into madness that will stick with you long after the final page. If you're looking for an indie horror anthology that hits the ground running, refuses to let you catch your breath, and updates the campfire stories of your youth with a bloody modern edge, this is an absolute must read. Which kind of brings me to my take. And I had to put out that short video the other day simply because I had to pump the brakes hardcore, like I said, probably 2 or 3 times in that other video when I got to the Crimson Canvas, just simply because it blew me away. And if you do pick up the book, I hope it hits you the same way that it hit me. But when I come back to my comparisons for it, that's why it hit me so hard, because as an ex Magic the Gathering player, um, Rakdos, the red black, was one of my favorite um, color wheels to play. And more often than not, I ended up killing myself in the game. Just out of just it's just absolute chaos. Um, and for those Magic players out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about, man. Rakdos was nuts. You could put together some pretty decent decks with it, but yeah, overall, like, you were usually taking more damage per turn than your opponent. But that's what this story made me feel. Just like playing that, but like on a real scale, if that makes sense. But moving away from that, uh, the story immediately reminded me of the Darth Moment storyline in the Darth Vader comics a while back. And where it really got me into the whole indie sphere to begin with was some fan fiction writing. And although the character that I took on was Ahsoka, I spent a lot of time trying to pay homage to all the authors and creatives that gave me that Star Wars uh, environment to work with and universe to begin with. But one of the most creative Sith Lords um, that really doesn't have a lot of mention, but was instrumental in Vader's citadel construction on Mustafar was Darth Momin. And if there's any interest in wanting to know more of the story, I mean, I could send you in all different directions for that. But Darth Momin himself, even as a child, is why I was so interested in Crimson Canvas because he, to me, was the initial creator of the painting that's the focal point of that short story here. If you're familiar, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. And if not, I mean, if you're interested in learning more, I would love to expand on that. But I mean, only if you're interested in it. I mean, I have my opinion. I know what I'm talking about. I think, yeah. I mean, all right, it's in my head. If you want to know more, just reach out. Email is always available, and by all means, throw a comment below. But at any rate, that story is surrounded by amazing other ones. Now, I just picked out a few of them. Um, that did drop some dark ride hints in there too. That is an amazing story. The Widow really, that one took me. It took me. I was not prepared for it. Let's just put it that way. And then when you read Scarecrow, you think you know what you're getting into, and then you turn the page, and it's a lot more insane that you even thought it. A lot more insane than you thought it would ever become. Um, but at any rate, as I try to wrap up the video, uh, I love short stories, and when you get an author that can put together 13 of them that are similar but dissimilar, all in the same breath, but all have the same level of like nitroglycerin injection. Yeah, they just keep you frantic. You're just turning page after page after page because you want to know where you're getting to. And then, like I mentioned in the video, you get to the next story and it's something else completely, but that frantic pacing is still there. At any rate, highly, highly recommend this book. And because of this review, I really, really do want to check out the author's next book that was actually recent released right at the end of 2025, I believe, Popcorn and Guts. So yeah, we'll be purchasing the book for sure, and more than likely covering it again, covering another Tucker Joneson book. But at any rate, I digress. Um, so before we permanently close the file on Tucker Joneson, the archive must look forward to the next set of coordinates. The ledger demands constant excavation, and our next audit is already proving to be an entirely different frequency of dread. We are actively pulling the structural blueprints for John Michael Lane's debut novel, Seasons of Ash. I'm currently sitting at the threshold of Chapter 9, and the telemetry is already alarming. We aren't dealing with vampires or localized cursed geography this time. Lane is operating with an extreme post-apocalyptic framework, and by extreme, I mean the immediate suffocating hours right after the collapse. A suspected supervolcano erupts 10,000 miles away, and the global system failure is absolute. What immediately sets this architecture apart is how Lane weaponizes the unknown. The horror isn't just the ash falling from the sky, it is the frantic, terrifying math the reader's mind begins to perform, while the story establishes its intricate world building. We track Matt Anderson, an ex Marine major stranded in Nevada, who is forced to navigate a fracturing society with the hyper compact, fluid precision of his military training. But Lane utilizes a split focus, dual breach mechanism to ensure the observer never feels safe. While Matt is executing a brutal cross country survival run, the perspective violently shifts back to the east, to the Appalachian Mountains. We follow his wife Laura, who has been instructed over a brief phone call to grab the zombie stash and get their two children to a secluded family farm in Greenbank. This is where the true narrative mechanics of Seasons of Ash click into place. The physical environment is highly hostile, but the absolute dread comes from the stripping away of human morality. The sensory writing is intensely visceral. You can literally feel the slick, abrasive grit of the ash in every breath. Our early field notes confirm that the slow burn pacing is highly purposeful, pitting the character's resilience against the chilling, calculated malice of opportunistic figures like Preacher Gideon Crow. Lane isn't just writing an action-heavy disaster thriller. He is constructing a high-stakes, character-driven study of the experimental psyche, forcing us to ask exactly what we are willing to sacrifice to stay human when the power grid fails and the worst of humanity begins to circle. If you thought Blood in the Dark tested your survival instincts, Seasons of Ash is going to put you right in the center of a very different, deeply grounded nightmare. The full expose and structural audit is coming next. And that brings us to the close of today's entry. Before you disconnect from the archive, I need to check your telemetry. Drop a comment down below. Have you survived Tucker Jonason's Blood in the Dark yet? Or looking ahead to Seasons of Ash, how do you think your own experimental psyche would hold up when the grid goes down? Let me know. If this structural audit provided value today, ensure your connection to the archive remains active. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on that notification bell. It is the best way to manipulate the algorithm and help other readers discover these hidden architectural blueprints. As always, you can directly support the Veiled Archive and help keep the ledger running by visiting our merch store link below. Remember that 50%, and always 50%, of all proceeds go directly to the Speculative Literary Foundation to support the architects who build these nightmares. Stay out of the dark, and we will see you on the next